lest these become my concluding thoughts too, it's probably better. Anyway, it's fine. This is absolutely fine. And so I'll try to be probably brief so that we do not repeat ideas, because fortunately many of the things that I could have said have already been said, and in a way the tone has already been set. Because both the inaugural address, where the problems of nationalism, primarily the problems of nationalism, were raised, and the next address, which went on to say that nevertheless, in spite of its problems, there is probably a need to hold on to or even revitalize an alternate kind of nationalism. Both of these would pretty much form the basic template of what I'm going to talk about. The schedule would seem to suggest, the program of the conference would seem to suggest that I would have talked primarily about Tagore on nationalism. Well, that would be pretty much my starting point. But since this conference and the concept note that this conference publicized also suggests that we should not only stop with a cynical critique of nationalism. Nationalism indeed is pure evil. There is no doubt about that. Nationalism with a capital N is, and that is what I'm just kind of almost making not a caricature but a summary of what Tagore's take on nationalism would be all about. But having said that, and as the concept note of this conference clearly pointed out, that maybe we still have to reconfigure nationalism, maybe an alter nationalism, to reclaim the nation, as it were. Reclaim the nation, reclaim the plural nation, reclaim the inclusive nation from precisely those evil forces which, in the name of making a monolithic nation with a capital N, and the brutal forces of nationalism with capital N, rule roughshod over the pluralities of this country. It is precisely to reclaim the nation from them, reclaim the nation from the fascist forces, reclaim the nation in the name of the pluralities that our country indeed inhabits, is inhabited by, that we have to talk about a reconfiguring of nationalism, an alter nationalism beyond Tagore's immediate, let's say, what should we say, immediate rejection of nationalism per se. So that would have been the agenda of my talk in any case. I would have begun with Tagore. I would have moved, I'm trying to move as far as away from the mic because I in any case speak rather loudly and I'm sure I'd be audible enough. So that would have been, when the organizers, and I must thank the organizers for inviting me to begin with, a thank that I should have probably given right at the beginning. But when several months back, the organizers had asked me to speak at this conference, this would have been the structure of my talk in any case, which is I would have begun with Tagore, talked about the problems with nationalism that Tagore points out, tried to figure out what could potentially be the way out. I'm just short-circuiting what will still be the bulk of my talk, would have moved to through Kant and trying to define how hospitality in itself as geared through the nation, the idea of the nation, the notion of the nation, may not necessarily lead to a possible alternative, and ended up through a brief detour through Derrida and Saila Ben Habib, who you may or may not have heard of, but we'll talk about her, to the possibility of other cosmopolitanisms, where through democratic iterations, through people's movements, through people's iterations on the streets, through democratized chit-chat, we can recover an alternative to nationalism with a capital N, which however does not necessarily move into a dilettante kind of cosmopolitanism, which is kind of always holier than thou but never really delivers much. Structure of my talk before you. I'll add one more thinker who would have talked about this possibility of, and that is Julia Kristeva, and Kristeva's very major book, a 1993 book, which otherwise I would not have really taken, because the title is significant, Nations Without Nationalism. That's the title of Julia Kristeva's very famous 1993 book, where she precisely talks about how there can be nations without nationalism. But anyway, I will take recourse to Julia Kristeva too, because she, beyond the possibility of national time, in her much more famous and much, let's say, something that precedes Nations Without Nationalism, in her famous article, which most of us will be familiar with, Women's Time, In women's time, Christopher had already talked about how, as opposed to national time, as opposed to the linearly defined political time of the nation, one can have, and she theorized it in a particular way, women's time. And I see women's time working itself out right now as we speak in reclaiming nationalism, in reclaiming the nation, in reconfiguring nationalism. And therefore I would stop at the end by briefly kind of also recalling what Motherland, or even trying to make a fetishized goddess emerge out of the nation itself, the nation as a mother. But what about the nation being of mothers? Not the nation as a mother, but the nation of mothers. And that is something that we'll come back to. So the maternal angle that is already entailed within the idea of the nation, etymologically and otherwise, and how the reclaiming of nationalism has to also be a reclaiming of that maternal aspect from the fetishized, idolized notion of a motherland as icon to be worshipped probably by masculinist forces, rather looking at the nation itself as being of the woman, the nation itself as being one that is particularly imbibed with this possibility of giving birth. But that's a point that I should have mentioned at my prefatory level. But let's move on. So nationalism is indeed a jingoistic discourse and an evil, so to say, and I can present to you some of the choicest quotes by Tagore to that effect, because Tagore in his 1917 nationalism lectures clearly points out how evil nationalism per se is. And so this is just to share some quotes from Tagore to have a sense of how, and though it was rightly put by Mary earlier that maybe that was in a context, and if Tagore was writing today, he may have been talking otherwise, and Einstein or whosoever at a particular point of time would have thought of the nation as being more evil than a nation would have been seen to be at other points of time. But I still think that Tagore's point generally holds. And so I'll just give you, as I said, some choicest quotes. So this is what Tagore's view of the nation is. I'll just one after the other. So nationalism and nationalism both taken together, nation with a capital N and nationalism also with a capital N. So this is something that was already cited in the previous talk. So right. So nationalism is a great menace. We know that. It is the particular thing which for years has been at the bottom of India's troubles. So nationalism is the primary cause behind India's troubles. He also goes on to define nation itself, the nation as being primarily a political and economic union of people. And I'm just quoting again. When the organization of politics and commerce, whose other name is the nation with a capital N, becomes all-powerful at the cost of the harmony of the higher social life, then it is an evil day for humanity. Unquote. So the words are strong, and I'll keep on deliberately reading some of these choicest quotes from Tagore's lectures on nationalism, which thereafter have been published as Nationalism, 1917, as you all know, originally composed in English, unlike most of Tagore's works. So Tagore clearly sees the nation with a capital N as evil, as a menace, nationalism being the ultimate evil, the primary cause behind India's worries and India's troubles. And he has his reasons to believe that, because the moment we talk about nation with a capital N, what Tagore would say, we, people of no nations, or we people of multiple nations, we people of diverse nations, multiple languages, multiple races, multiple cultures, we, the moment we start getting hegemonically conceived as belonging to one nation with a capital N, something very brutal necessarily happens in that homogenization. So I'll just read on. And again, Tagore says, and I'm quoting, whenever I'll be quoting, and I'll be primarily quoting for the next few minutes. So whenever I'll be quoting, I'll say that I'm quoting. And the idea of the nation is one of the most powerful anesthetics. So the nation is also an anesthetic. It numbs people that man has invented. So the most powerful anesthetic that man has invented. Under the influence of its fumes, the whole people can carry out its systematic program of the most virulent self-making without being in the least aware of its moral perversion. In fact, feeling dangerously resentful if it is pointed out. So not only do we get anesthetized by the fumes of nationalism, but furthermore, and this is more and more what we've been seeing over the last few years, that we become so intoxicated with the fumes of nationalism with a capital N that any legitimate critique also immediately gets branded as anti-national, because nation becomes the convenient rhetoric to be able to clearly also suppress any possible dissent. But anyway, as Tagore goes on to say further, and I'll maybe read out a couple of quotes more from Tagore just to get the ball rolling and to get the general sense of Tagore's take on the nation, and which would hold pretty true even now as being the point. So again, I'm quoting from Tagore, and here Tagore directly talks about India being too vast. I'm quoting, India is too vast in its area and too diverse in its races. It is many countries packed in one geographical receptacle. Be it said to the credit of India that this diversity was not her own creation. She has had to accept it as a fact from the beginning of her history. In America and Australia, and this is where Tagore is at his acerbic best, at his sarcastic best, he says, in America and Australia, Europe has simplified her problem by almost exterminating the original population. And clearly, I mean, we would not want such a thing to happen. Let me return back to the quote. Even in the present age, this spirit of extermination is making itself manifest by inhospitably shutting out aliens through those who themselves were aliens in the lands they now occupy. And which should ring very loudly to our ears. But India tolerated difference of races from the first, and that spirit of toleration has acted all through her history. Needless to say, and now especially since we are talking about migration, we are talking about aliens to be admitted or not to be admitted within the hallowed spaces of what must be constructed as the nation with a capital N, these words do ring very, very strongly because precisely the Indian nation that we need to cherish and which our alter nationalisms of inclusion must absolutely build themselves on is precisely about being accommodative, as India has always been. Being accommodative of aliens from all over rather than shutting down its doors on certain communities as an exclusivist definition of citizenship would allow us to do. Just to read on again from Tagore and to quote him, I'm quoting again, we have to recognize that the history of India does not belong to one particular race, but is of a process of creation to which various races of the world contributed. The Dravidians and the Aryans, the ancient Greeks and the Persians, the Mohammedans of the West and those of Central Asia, etc., etc. He goes on. And this is the idea of India, that unfortunately nation with a capital N. The idea of the nation, the idea of the unified nation, clearly tries to obliterate or clearly tries to homogenize, and therefore indeed for Tagore, nation with a capital N emerges as the evil that one has to fight against. Tagore of course goes on to say further, and this is something that I've already mentioned, but now probably reading it out would be better, that India never really had nationalism, so to say. We were never a people of nations. We were not a nation, so to say. But anyway, the particular quote that I'm reading is, India has never had a real sense of nationalism. Even though from childhood I've been taught that the idolatry of nation with a capital N is almost better than reverence for God and humanity, I believe I have outgrown that teaching. And it is my conviction that my countrymen will gain truly their India. Our countrymen will gain their India by fighting against the education which teaches them that a country is greater than the ideals of humanity. Unquote. So this is something that Tagore would have said several years back, and it rings absolutely, absolutely relevant even in our own times. And this is the last quote that I'll read from Tagore, because as I said, I'll just read pell-mell some choicest quotes from 3 long lectures which comprise the volume Nationalism, just to give a sense from Tagore's perspective what nation, how evil the idea of nation with a capital N is. So maybe this is the last quote that I'll read for the time being. I'll just return to Tagore in a minute once I'll take my second detour into Kant as to what can be therefore the alternative. Can it be hospitality as it has been theorized elsewhere? But anyway, so warmongering politicians, this is the next thing that Tagore has to say, how they invoke the idea of nation with a capital N for their own petty ends, and in the process they irreparably mutilate humanity. So that is the sum and substance of this last quote that I am reading currently. I'm quoting: "The nation," that is with a capital N, "the nation has thriven long upon mutilated humanity. Men, the fairest creations of God, came out of the national manufactory in huge numbers as war-making and money-making puppets, ludicrously vain of their pitiful perfection of mechanism. Human society grew more and more into a marionette show of politicians, soldiers, manufacturers and bureaucrats, pulled by wire arrangements of wonderful efficiency." Unquote. But anyway, one could have read on at length, but the point simply remains that, as Tagore had pointed out, in a particular context, needless to say, which is during the First World War, during a time when nationalism had raised its ugly heads all over, and including in India. Tagore's take on the entire Swadeshi movement is well known. Tagore's differences, divergences with the kind of nationalism that even Indian nationalists at that point in time showed is well known and is well documented in several novels like Ghade Baire, like Gora, etc. But let me stop with Tagore here for the time being. So while Tagore does point out that nationalism with a capital N is pure evil, it's an ultimate menace, and we cannot give up this multinational plural reality of ours, this human reality of ours, to this idolatry of nation with a capital N, and instead we have to reclaim it. We have to reclaim it from the warmongering politicians. But that being said, what is the other alternative? Where do we go to if, let's say, jingoistic nationalism, which relies on exclusion, jingoistic nationalism which relies on homogenization, jingoistic nationalism which relies precisely on the erasure of differences, if that has to be opposed, if that is indeed evil, and if we have to go beyond that, then what is the other alternative? So can the other alternative be hospitality, cosmopolitanism, the way many, including Kant, would have theorized? So that seems to be the next possibility, and I will just weigh that option to see whether the kind of hospitality, the kind of cosmopolitanism that was originally theorized by Kant way back in Perpetual Peace, that's an important article, again I'm sure most of us would be familiar with it, in 1795, when Kant's point primarily was that now, in a way, the polity, the economy in Europe has reached such a stage that nations cannot afford to be at war with each other. They have to, for the sake of their own stability, for the sake of their own economic prosperity, they have to see to it that they don't have war with each other, and there is therefore perpetual peace. And Kant's suggestion was that there would be perpetual peace, there would be hospitality, there would be some kind of a bedrock to cosmopolitanism, precisely because nations will now tolerate each other. Nations with a capital N, once again, would start tolerating each other rather than being an exclusion of each other, rather than fighting with each other, because they have to tolerate each other for economic stability, for economic prosperity. Now, while this is all very true, and this could indeed have been true, nations becoming hospitable to each other, so to say, but what is to be noted is that here the nation still has the agency. It is not a perpetual peace that is caused irrespective of the nation, without the nation. The nation, even with a capital N, still seems to have the agential role in this kind of a perpetual peace. And furthermore, and let me just quote from Kant again, a very short passage, to see what Kant's idea in perpetual peace of hospitality is, so that the other possibility that we often talk about, so on the one hand there is jingoistic nationalism, on the other hand there is hospitality, there is tolerance of the other, but to what extent can that work out would be clear if we just read this short passage from Kant, from Perpetual Peace 1795, where we would see that the Kantian notion of hospitality, which did become the bedrock of a lot of theorizations on cosmopolitanism thereafter, is however still rooted in the nation and is fairly exclusionary in nature. In fact, just let me read rather than talking. So I'm quoting Kant here. Hospitality means the right of a stranger not to be treated as an enemy when he arrives in the land of another. So far so good. One may refuse to receive him when this can be done without causing his destruction, but so long as he peacefully occupies his place, one may not treat him with hostility. It is not the right to be a permanent visitor that one may demand. A special contract of beneficence would be needed in order to give an outsider a right to become a fellow inhabitant for a certain length of time. It is only the right of temporary sojourn, a right to associate, which all men have. They have it by virtue of their common possession of the surface of the earth. Numerous nationalists with a capital N coming together of global fascists together into some kind of a fascist confederation, as it were, might become an even greater threat to we, the people of no nations, we, the people who would rather reclaim our small n nations from that evil of the capital N nation. So then what is the way out? Now clearly Kant's model would not therefore be satisfactory. To kind of cut to the chase and also to do justice to time maybe, one can immediately, since I've already read the skeleton before you, one can immediately move on to Derrida, who in his general take on cosmopolitanism and forgiveness, that's the name of his book also, as you know, on cosmopolitanism and forgiveness, he critiques Kant, the same kind of critique that we have already issued, and the same kind of critique that Tagore most prophetically had issued almost 90 years back or more. So the same kind of critique Derrida also engages in, that this is conditional hospitality. And Derrida instead draws us, as we all know, beyond. So Kant cannot be claimed to be the inceptor of hospitality, of cosmopolitanism, as we often take him to be. Kant did not really provide something novel and something innovative. On the contrary, Derrida goes on to suggest that Kant, or the Kantian model of hospitality and cosmopolitanism, almost provides a roadblock in an otherwise pre-existing history of tolerance, a pre-existing history of being hospitable to the other. And this other regarding this becomes very important, as you know, in Derridian thought per se. He talks about the long tradition of hospitality, and I really do not have the time or the energy to go into it, but as we would know, Derrida primarily, because his reading formation is his reading formation, and we can always add our reading formation to it. So he talks about both the Hellenic and the Hebraic tradition, which are the two traditions that he is familiar with, and he shows how both in terms of the Stoics and the Cynics, and so the pre-Socratic and para-Socratic and extra-Socratic philosophers and their own models of hospitality, and also in the Abrahamic tradition, both the Pauline tradition and the Abrahamic tradition, that is both Abraham and Paul, show signs of in the Bible, within Hebraic literature, signs of hospitality, signs of tolerance, and we could talk about it at some other point of time, because there is a lot to be said here. Similarly, we could add from maybe our Indian fountainhead of knowledge the idea of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the whole world, mind you, not the whole world minus this community, not the whole world minus people coming from those countries, the whole world, the Vasudha is your relative. So anyway, we have had in the Indic tradition, in the Hellenic tradition, in the Hebraic tradition, long traditions of extremely rich hospitality. And Derrida draws our attention to it, and of course goes on to suggest that Kant's conditional hospitality should not be seen as the primary model of hospitality. Rather, we have to draw ourselves to those older fountainheads of hospitable knowledge. And that also leads to a very important point, which is these old fountainheads of knowledge also come from a point of time when nations didn't exist. These are pre-national bodies of knowledge. and which also leads Derrida therefore to theorize in our current times of the site of hospitality being not the nation state, but rather cities of refuge, as he would call. And Derrida's theorization of cities of refuge is well known, how many cities have become the site of people from all over the world congregating for different reasons, and the cities therefore themselves becoming these wonderful melting pots of diverse cultures, diverse people tolerating each other, being hospitable to each other, and even the original inhabitants of that particular urban space being open to welcoming strangers from all over, and the cities becoming these fertile, fantastic spaces of hospitality, and how cities therefore become the site for hospitality rather than nation, which in the Kantian model was pretty much still the agent, and therefore we hadn't moved much beyond nation with a capital N, because we were still stuck with the nation. But this idea of cities and the whole possibility of cities therefore being the alternative site, which is our second alternative model therefore. We've just moved from Kant's model to Derrida's model of cities of refuge, almost autonomous cities, the cosmopolis, so to say, the polis being the site where through certain kinds of cosmopolitanism we will through our own urban rhetoric be able to defeat the jingoistics of nationalism with a capital N and be able to somehow create a hospitable atmosphere. That itself is also a bit suspect, because on the one hand, and therefore I would move on to my next point, on the one hand, this puts focus on a privileged urban space as being the space, the only space where such renegotiations can take place, while the bulk of our country and the bulk of the world indeed is not urban, not even suburban, peri-urban. So maybe this making the urban spaces as being the sites of such experimental makeovers might also be somewhat hierarchical and somewhat already loaded in one direction. And needless to say, cosmopolitanism might be seen as something as dilettante. I mean, we were talking about it at the beginning. So if we pose as opposed to nationalism with a capital N, as opposed to the evil jingoistic forces of nationalism with a capital N, if we foreground these free spaces in cities where people just hang around, and lovely cities of refuge where people within only the protocol of those urban spaces have these little luxuries of freedom, etc., then maybe we are really proposing something that is merely dilettante and not really the alternative to the problems of nationalism. Incidentally, Tagore also has something to say about this. In the same book on nationalism, he clearly steers clear of both the extremes. And again, I'm just quoting Tagore. So Tagore says, and this is a very, very short quote, just half a line. He says, "Neither the colorless vagueness of cosmopolitanism nor the fierce self-idolatry of nation worship is the goal of human history." Unquote. So neither the idolatry of nation worship, that point is already taken, but nor the vagueness of cosmopolitanism. And this kind of potential dilettantism, potential vagueness is something that the kind of cosmopolitanism that we saw evolve not only through Kant, which had its own problems, but even through the Derridean notion of cities of refuge being the privileged sites of such hospitality, is something that we therefore should note and not necessarily therefore propose as the antidote to nationalism, as the template to reconfigure nationalism. Though urban spaces are very important, and even the kind of people's struggles that we are seeing now are happening mostly in urban spaces, though not exclusively in urban spaces. So this leads us to the third possibility. So beyond the Kantian notion of cosmopolitanism, beyond the Derridean notion of cities of refuge, to the third possibility, and since I've already preempted my entire talk before you, you know precisely what I'm talking about. So Sayla Ben Habib, Seyla Ben Habib, who you may, as I said, may or may not have heard of, but she is worth reading. So she has this 2006 book called Another Cosmopolitanism. It's a fantastic book because rather than the cosmopolitanism, the vague cosmopolitanism, the dilettante cosmopolitanism, the urban, the metropolitan cosmopolitanism, which we feared Derrida was ultimately proposing, Sayla Ben Habib talks about another cosmopolitanism. And what is this another cosmopolitanism? Where does this another cosmopolitanism come from? So again, I would just to illustrate what the possibilities of this another cosmopolitanism is, because rather than urban, rarefied sites, how a participatory cosmopolitanism might emerge through democratic iterations, that is something that is very important, and therefore I would again like to just read you some passages, maybe, as it always helps, from Saila Ben Habib. So anyway, Saila Ben Habib says, and I'll just try to figure out some quotes from her to present you, to give you a flavor. So she talks about new forms of cosmopolitanism. And where do these new forms come from? These new forms come from political agency and subjectivity, which are in iteration. Democratic iterations. I'm not quoting entire passages, just the key phrases would be good enough. So democratic iterations where through participation, through continuous invocation and revocation of the established view, through continuous democratic discursive practices of dissenting, of disputing, and the people themselves, rather than, and as Saila Ben Habib points out, and without really quoting her, but nevertheless stating what she has to say, rather than being subjects of law, when the people become the authors of law, that is the real instance of a democratic iteration to have happened. So rather than the law already having been dictated, having been written down for you, if we can become authors of law, if we can write the law, then, I mean, through such democratic iterations within spaces, and let me just again maybe give some stray quotes. So for Ben Habib, for instance, cosmopolitanism, it's not a threat to democratic sovereignty, but it rather, and that is also a very important point, I mean, so that we understand that all this is aimed towards a revitalization of sovereignty, of reimagining nationalisms. So I'm just quoting, so Ben Habib says it is rather the emergence of new political configurations and new forms of agency inspired by the interdependence of individuals with the state and vice versa. And this can really be the template to a cosmopolitics to come. Another cosmopolitanism where the people through democratic iterations can author laws rather than be only subjects of law, and therefore reclaim the nation, and reclaim the nation not really as a possible dilettante, vague cosmopolitanism to be practiced in urban cycles, but rather one that would be the template of another cosmopolitanism altogether. And here is where I would go back to the beginning of my talk. I see this happening. In an earlier occasion, if this conference had happened 2 months back, or as I had originally conceived, I may have probably stopped here, giving a further rhetorical conclusion to how, therefore, reconfiguring nationalism has to happen through people's participation, people's movements on the streets, through democratic iterations, where we author the laws, we take on the laws, we rewrite the laws, and in a way reclaim the nation against jingoistic nationalism with a capital N. I could have stopped here, but now